me to write you in the chat, private chatting, or maybe I can just say it?
Whatever you prefer.
We are live right now. Okay, we are live. Okay. Let me just check the waiting room. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we are going to talk about a very important topic. It's about Yemen. At first, I would like to welcome our three experts tonight. We have Dr. Anel Shalin. She's a Middle East Research Fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Then we have Julia Palik. She's a senior researcher at Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And we also have Mr. Ibrahim Jalal. He's a non-resident scholar and he's working in the Gulf Affairs and Yemen program at Middle East Institute. Welcome everyone. And I also would like to welcome everyone who is joining us today. Let's talk about peace. Actually, we are in the middle of a war in Yemen. 6 years passed since the beginning of the war in Yemen, and people actually started talking about peace. Is it time for peace? Maybe we need more war. Who knows? People are saying no, it's not enough. Maybe others are saying no, it's enough and it's time for peace. The whole international community is trying best to push Yemen into peace. And now I would like to start this discussion with opening remarks from Dr. Anel. Then after that, we will have Julia, then Ibrahim. So the floor is yours, Anel.
Mohammed, thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to get to be on this panel and to speak about this crucial topic. You gave us a series of questions to respond to, but I think maybe, first of all, just respond quickly to something you mentioned just now, this question of, have we had enough war? And I think, unfortunately, at the moment, the incentives on the ground continue to perpetuate war, that there are many actors in Yemen that are benefiting from the current situation, although clearly the international image of Yemen reflects all of the many victims who are suffering and dying as a result of this 6 years of war. And unfortunately, what we don't see as often are the many people that are benefiting, people who are getting rich on all the resources flowing in, who are building big villas outside Sana'a and elsewhere in the country, who are willing to benefit from the misery of their fellow Yemenis. And I think this dynamic is sometimes lost when a lot of the focus tends to be on the international actors who are indeed responsible and need to very much be held responsible. But I think sometimes we lose sight of the extent to which many people on the ground are benefiting, which always happens in war, unfortunately. And in addition to obviously the incentives for large weapons manufacturers, especially based in the United States, also in Europe, who are very much at fault for sort of wishing for conflicts like these to continue because it allows them to continue to make massive profits. So though very much those incentives also need to be shifted. That's sort of a broader global question about how the world can try to shift this profit incentive where these huge companies continue to wish for ongoing conflict and devastation. That's a bigger question. But within Yemen itself, I do think a crucial factor to consider are the ways in which powerful actors on the ground are benefiting and continue to benefit. This is often complex. So actors like the Hadi government, which is obviously seen as fighting against the Houthis, which it is, but in some ways, agents of the Hadi government are allowing or abetting the smuggling that benefits Houthis. And so again, the extent to which conflict often is portrayed as kind of one side versus another, often doesn't reflect the complexities on the ground. And this is part of why the conflict in Yemen is so intractable. Let me get to some of the questions that you had posed for us. So the first was about Martin Griffiths' Peace Initiative. And I myself and many others have been frustrated at the lack of progress coming from Griffiths himself and from the UN in general. Yesterday, he condemned Houthi violence against Ma'rib, and he called for the Yemeni government to allow fuel and food to enter Hodeidah port. Although I think in this, he probably should have also asked the Saudis to allow fuel and food to enter the port. He made good and commendable statements. The notion, and I'll just quote him a little bit, the notion that in any negotiation, the parties need to know where they are going. They need to clearly see the end state. It is important to reiterate that this end state should be guided by the aspirations of Yemenis, a future marked by peaceful political participation, accountable governance, equal citizenship, economic justice. This is what time and again Yemeni women, youth, civil society, political parties, community leaders, all the people of Yemen own that vision of the future. So he's saying a lot of the things that Yemenis want to hear, and yet it's unclear how exactly he's going to do that. He does express support for the fact that the Biden administration appointed Tim Lenderking, who's returned already. He's been in the region, meeting with relevant counterparts, which again it's commendable that the Biden administration is trying to move relatively quickly on this, which is necessary given U.S. complicity in what's happening in Yemen. But again, it's just not entirely clear how those commendable objectives are going to be achieved. I think, although he condemned the violence in Ma'rib, again, it's not clear why the Houthis would necessarily pull back or make any sort of moves towards that sort of shared vision of a peaceful Yemen that reflects accountable governance, which to my understanding, the vast majority of Yemenis want to see for their country. But at the moment, the Houthis' incentives are such that they see that they could take Ma'rib, and they're likely to continue to push to do so. And it's just unclear how Griffiths or the UN is going to be able to pressure them to get them to stop their assault on Ma'rib. The next question had to do with the American vision for peace in Yemen. And my concern is that the Biden team mainly wants to end US complicity in the war without taking responsibility for supporting a just resolution of the conflict, or that they may try to rush through a quick ceasefire agreement that leaves the Houthis in charge of the north and the Southern Transitional Council and UAE in control of the south. So to my understanding, and I know that not everyone agrees with this, but my sense is that Biden should pressure Saudi Arabia and the UAE to fully withdraw militarily, as well as ending their ongoing support for belligerent factions. He should be very clear that Saudi Arabia and the UAE can either continue to interfere in Yemen, or they can maintain a relationship with the US, but they cannot have both. And he has tried to assuage Saudi concerns by saying clearly that the US will help Saudi Arabia defend itself. So hopefully this would allow the Saudis to withdraw. Again, this doesn't take care of the issues of the Houthis taking over Ma'rib and consolidating control over all of North Yemen. And I understand this concern, which I share. The other question had to do with the nuclear deal with Iran and its impact in the war on Yemen. And this is another area of concern because I think Biden's calculus may end up holding Yemen hostage to these negotiations with Iran, whether it's the returning to the nuclear deal, as well as, hopefully subsequent negotiations between Iran and members of the GCC over concerns about non-nuclear weapons, conventional weapons and missiles, etc. So until the US has a working relationship with Iran, Biden has no way to ask Iran to end its support for the Houthis. If diplomatic relations were reestablished and the Iran nuclear deal reaffirmed, my hope is that Biden would then pressure Iran to withdraw support. But in the meantime, many in Yemen will suffer and die, and who knows how long that process will take. In addition, the Houthis will maintain their belligerence even if Iran withdraws support. So sort of relying on this notion that Iran is the crucial actor that will rein in the Houthis is not going to be effective. So instead, Biden has to find ways of pressuring the Houthis directly. And I think this is part of why it was important for the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation, the FTO designation, to be lifted, because otherwise the US can't legally interact with the Houthis. And again, I know there are many Yemenis who detest the Houthis and don't want to see them granted any further legitimacy, such as by the US formally negotiating with them. But this is the unfortunate reality that I think is necessary for trying to achieve a better outcome in Yemen. The next question was about the Saudi vision for peace, which I think is a little bit of a misnomer. I don't know that the Saudis are all that interested in peace in Yemen, except to the extent to which it might get the Houthis to stop shooting missiles at them. Because the Saudis' policy towards Yemen has always been keeping it both too weak and too strong to pose a danger to them. And in that, I'm quoting Helen Lackner, esteemed expert on Yemen. And MBS miscalculated. The military intervention has exacerbated all conditions the Saudis were afraid of, that the Iranians were supporting the Houthis and the ability of the Houthis to threaten Saudi territory. And yet, to my understanding, the Saudis have not also provided sufficient support for Hadi's forces to allow them to win when they fight against the Houthis. So again, as I said at the beginning, the current situation in Yemen is enriching warlords and those who provide what warlords want. Again, as I said, even the Hadi government has been implicated in smuggling goods to the Houthis. So the incentives are completely misaligned to try to move towards peace, which is why Biden must pressure Saudi Arabia to fully withdraw, as well as to lift the blockade, although again, this may initially empower the Houthis, which many fear. But again, this is crucial for sort of being able to shift the incentives to allow Yemen's economy to start to come back online. And my hope and my sense of Yemenis themselves is that, you know, there are many groups, actors, tribal actors as well, who would not tolerate Houthi rule, that they're fighting alongside the Houthis at present because they're fighting against the Saudi military intervention. But then moving forwards, you know, these are not individuals who will tolerate sort of the ongoing rule of a group of people that they disagree with. And so the final question had to do with Yemeni government options for dealing with the Houthi rebellion. Again, this is very, very tricky to resolve given the apparent Houthi strength. However, Martin Griffiths also laid out a few suggestions for this, that essentially there are ways to try to coax the Houthis to the negotiating table. For example, things like ensuring the unhindered flow of fuel and other commodities into Yemen through Hodeidah ports. Allowing this, the Houthis would need to be involved with this, but it's very important that civil servant salaries based on the 2014 payroll database are finally allowed to be paid, to be released. Opening up Sana'a airport to commercial international traffic, that hopefully these sorts of measures of allowing North Yemen to breathe a little bit and sort of come back online, again, in the short term may appear to empower the Houthis, but my hope is that in the longer term, as Yemenis are able to sort of reassert themselves, that they would be able to push back against Houthi rule, and that moving forward, the Biden administration should do everything in its power to support a negotiated settlement agreement that would bring all relevant Yemeni actors to the table, all Yemeni actors to the table, and that this should be allowed, you know, to, if need be, you know, this shouldn't be rushed. That again, my concern is that Biden may want this to happen very quickly and to just kind of wash his hands of it and say he's done, but that this will probably take a long time, and that eventually what may end up happening, my hope for Yemen in the future would be probably a federal system where local government, you know, that decisions are not centralized, actors on the ground are able to sort of maintain control of their own affairs, and that this would also be implemented in part by having small local ceasefires, that in order to further incentivize the end of violence, that local actors on the ground need to be incentivized, that the reconstruction funds that the US and the EU and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Iran and all responsible actors should be on the hook to help pay for the reconstruction of Yemen, because they have so profited from its devastation. I'll stop there, but thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Actually, we will have the questions later, but I have one very important point, I think, and we should highlight this point. As you said, that Saudi Arabia does not have any interest in peace in Yemen. Our seminar here, so we are back to Dr. Julia.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm
yes, go ahead.
Anel will join back to us. I just want to echo her and say a massive thank you for having us. And also very nice seeing again Ibrahim, and once Anel will join back, it's also a pleasure and that you guys are hosting us. So it's a little bit unfortunate that she left, but I'm sure that she's going to join back to us. My name is Julia and I am working in Oslo at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, and I am a researcher, a political scientist working on Yemen. So I think it's kind of important for me to establish these basic facts, because then it might make it more understandable why am I saying what am I going to say. So you provided with us with a few topics, and it was interesting reading through them. Martin Griffiths' Peace Initiative, American Vision for Peace, Saudi Vision for Peace, the Iranian nuclear deal, and the Yemeni government's option. My immediate interpretation of these questions, which are super important, was that all these are rather macro, and mostly with the exception of the Yemeni government options for dealing with the Houthis, is more of an external perspective. And I think this is symptomatic of what's happening with the discussion on Yemen, that where are the Yemenis in this? What do Yemenis want, basically? Because we're talking about what external states want, but we do not necessarily have a shared understanding, especially outsiders, about what different Yemenis want for what reason. So just to touch upon the things that you mentioned, I will make 3 core points in this brief speech, and I'm going to keep the time too. So yes, someone is looking also great in that green mask, I can see that. So I think that the visions of the UN, as well as the Washington administration and the internationally recognized government of Houthi, are interconnected, but often quite competing. So the UN has lost leverage, in my experience and my understanding, in the country for a while. There hasn't been much progress on the Stockholm Agreement. And despite the special envoy's work on making parties to sign this joint declaration, not much really has happened, to be fair. Now it's great that the Americans took a markedly different rhetorical and symbolic approach, which I think is quite important, and we shouldn't undermine it. Yet this is not going to bring peace to Yemen. In itself, it can influence the Saudis' willingness and capacity to get involved, to stay involved, in Yemen. And the third part, and all these are kind of connected through the notion of legitimacy and local Yemeni legitimacy, in my mind. The Houthi government's legitimacy is quite fractured in Yemen, depending on which area and which groups we are looking at. So with this introductory thoughts, hoping to make sense all of this, I want to make 3 core points, and hopefully thought-provoking conversation afterwards. And the first is that Yemen is now great that it's on the media because of the markedly different stance that the Biden administration is taking. But even if the Saudis tomorrow are stopping all military attacks, this war is not going to end then. Why? Because it didn't start because of the Saudis. It has started a long time ago. My core research originally focused on the Sada Wars between 2004 and 2010, which was a forerunner, in a sense, to the current war. And getting the Saudis out of Yemen is impossible because their histories are so much interconnected, and also the enormous amount of remittances, which are very much an important factors of Yemen's economy. This is not going to disappear. Also, there is way less talk precisely because of the secretive nature of the Saudi Houthi backchannel talks, which have been going on for quite a while. And I view that backchannel probably as the most fruitful for the future. The second point beside this that I want to make is a serious reconsideration might be needed for UN Security Council Resolution 2216. This is still the basis of the UN Special Envoy's work, and although there is, as I have seen, or as we have heard, that there are frustrations with the special envoy, but the special envoy's room of maneuver is also limited by certain decisions, and one of them is this UN Security Council resolution, which as of today does not reflect political realities on the ground at all. So there will be a need on a UN level to change this situation. And the third point is also very much connected to the previous speaker's issue that she raised. And I think probably the most important point I want to make here is that the Houthis currently have no willingness or motivation neither to stop their military campaign nor to engage in a power sharing deal. Now, this is problematic, and their military power has significantly increased since 2014, mostly due to mostly due to the looting from the government stockpiles, and then later on from smuggling activities. Now, if this war hopefully will end in a peace agreement, all peace agreement addresses power sharing and what's happening with competing violence authorities. What's going to happen all to these weapons, for example? The Houthis are not going to get disarmed because they have never been as strong as they are now in terms of military power and controlling territory. So then these 3 points that I made just lead me to more questions, I think. And it is really about the political future. And I want to emphasize it at the expense of peace, because this is peace is not really going to come immediately to a country that has been through so much, and who is going to be held accountable within Yemen and outside Yemen? How is justice going to be delivered to the millions of victims to this conflict? And I would be very interested in hearing the participants' views, and especially Ibrahim's view, on what is going to be the role of the Houthis in the future political setting of Yemen, because I think this is a crucial question that has not been addressed sufficiently at all, at least not in the public debate, international debate about Yemen. So I leave it there, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Julia. You have made very remarkable comments on the Houthi side and also on the Griffiths initiative. I totally agree with you, saying that Griffiths, he and the UN behind him, they lost leverage on the Houthis, because Griffiths, until now, he spent 3 years working in Yemen, and we don't see really a concrete results of his work. Even the agreements he managed to make with the warring parties, most of them are not really being applied effectively. So let's go to Mr. Ibrahim. Then we will come back to the open discussion. Mr. Ibrahim Jalal, he's a non-resident scholar and working under the Gulf Affairs in Yemen program at the Middle East Institute. Mr. Ibrahim, are you there? Yeah, sorry. So that's Ibrahim.
Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite to Abad, and it's nice to be with Dr. Jolie and Dr. Anil. Let me begin by revisiting some of the major developments that happened since over the new year. So rightly after the new year, we had the FTO designation, and then it was posed by the beginning of the Biden administration. And that sent a clear message that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is a major concern for the new administration. And that extension was particularly supposed to be a month long. One of the aspects is to add a layer of predictability. So the Biden administration could have had time to review part of its Yemen policy and really imagine the ways and means of its engagement. But before the end of the month, it made so many fast-paced steps. It appointed a US Special Envoy, Linda King, who's well familiar with the region and has good connections with regional actors, the Yemeni government, as well as the Houthis. And then you had the FTO canceled. And that really where, many things were perceived as some messages of weakness or appeasement or otherwise. And that takes me to the first point. We are seeing, a continuously changing international landscape that projects Yemen from a humanitarian crisis landscape. And this humanitarian crisis is a byproduct of the political and security crises that have been happening since the coup d'etat back in September 2014. Because before then, we had, a fragile transitional peace process. We had a power sharing arrangement between the GPC and its partners, as well as the joint meeting parties and the revolutionary forces. So whenever you look to the future and think about power sharing, you look at bureaucratic rivalry. Back then, in the pre-2014 order, it was mainly, political rivalries. But now, and given the changes that happened over the past 6 years, whether the proliferation of capable armed non-state actors, such as, for example, the Houthis, who managed to consolidate power in the northwest and have even sent or they even invest on the political partnerships that they had with the GPC, and that ended with the murder of Ali Abdullah Saleh in December 2017. And that sends a strong political message to a wide range of Yemeni actors to whether or not they can cooperate and whether there could be tactical means to the broader Houthi vision and aspiration for Yemen. So just a few days ago, and Muhammad made that clear, we had the conclusion of the third year for the UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths. And Dr. Julia mentioned that 2216 is not the baseline or has been the baseline when it should not be. And this is quite problematic because looking back at the Stockholm Agreement, it was not based on 2216 in any way, shape, or form. And instead, it undermined the resolution to a large extent. It held the Houthis and the government on the same level when it came to military deployments, for example. So it did not recall as 2216 called, and that was withdrawal of militias, surrender of heavy arms, and that was one step to normalize the status quo. What happened since then is that the government position got weaker and weaker, in part because of the huge rivalries within the coalition-backed forces, mainly between the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council, as well as the Yemeni armed forces. And these have reflected through 2019 and 2020. No major significant advancements have been made, contrary to the Houthis, who made some advancements in Nahm and then in Jawf in the last year, and have been since March 2020 intensifying the offensives against Marib. And that goes to the point that Julia mentioned. The Houthis right now do not have an incentive to engage in the peace process, mainly because they are emboldened by the balance of power at the local level. And this has been, boosted up by recent messages that may have been not, properly sent from DC when it came to the FTO debate, while it addressed, and addressed and modified some of humanitarian concerns. It instead sent some, some signs of appeasement. And this is exactly when the Houthis reignited a large-scale offensive against Marib. And, by examining the messages that the Biden administration has sent, it doesn't seem that it has a vision for peace in Yemen. Instead, it has a ceasefire proposal and some sort of economic and humanitarian arrangements that coincide with the United Nations Special Envoy's proposal, and that is the joint declaration. And the joint declaration, if you've looked at the Houthi Peaceful Vision, which was published in 2020, is an extension or to a large extent, the base for the joint declaration. Many of the ideas presented there were kind of absorbed and reflected in the joint declaration. And these mark a continuation of normalizing the status quo on the ground. Because, 2216 is still there, but it had a lacking implementation mechanism. The subsequent agreement, such as the Stockholm Agreement, was far away from that. And the joint declaration, by extension, is a continuous normalization of peace processes. So right now, even Goethe does not have a vision for peace in Yemen. The United States does not. It just eyes it from reducing its direct involvement with the Saudis when it comes to liaison, coordination, intelligence support, etc. And no one has a vision for sustainable peace in Yemen. We must be honest and clear about that. Right now, all the imagination focuses on a ceasefire, and a ceasefire cannot be implemented. Anyone who understands the local dynamic in Marib, it has endured the intensive Houthi firefight in the past, mainly due to the airstrikes coming, because it technically destroyed several reinforcements before they attack. You just suspend that, and the Houthis would be able to send endless military reinforcement, and that's problematic. So the moment you have a ceasefire that is effective, the next question is, do we have an enforcement mechanism? Do we have carrots and sticks to push that forward? And that takes me to the next point, which is, where do we go about peace? Are we really far away from that? And I technically want to anchor the point mentioned by Julia. Even if the coalition surrenders now, the war will not stop. Its leading causes will continue. They're deeply internal. And the characterization of the conflict is largely not capturing the essence right now. For many Yemenis inside Yemen and outside the country, it has, the Republican imamate nexus, which dates back to the 1962. many of the Houthi ideals technically resonate with the Zaidi Hadawi indoctrination, which goes back to the very theological foundation and legitimacy of the imamate. And the problem is that the Republican forces cannot overcome their differences, which technically plays out to the advantage of the Houthis. And that idea that peace in the Westphalian order, where you have a monopoly of violence under one entity, is now heavily contested in many parts of the country. So the idea of legitimacy is eroding, and sub-legitimacies have been developing over the context of the conflict. But I don't want, by mentioning this, to undermine the will and the aspirations of the Yemeni people who want and dream of a more democratic, a more just, and a more fair Yemen for all Yemenis, regardless of their political affiliations, ideological beliefs and motives. And that goes back to question, what do the Houthis want in Yemen? Can they share power? Can they shift from acting like a militias into becoming a political party? Can they concede and make concessions? Can they work for the betterment of the lives of many Yemenis out there? And these are often met with huge doubts, whether from internal and external audiences. So going back to the question of peace, is peace just about talking on a table, shaking hands and taking pictures and signing some sort of agreement, and then you find out that you cannot implement it? Back in the 1970s, we had al-Musalaha al-Wataniya, which was the national reconciliation between the royalists and the Republicans. And it was hard to pave the way forward. And a couple of years before, the Egyptians and the Saudis had some sort of agreement in Jeddah. So although the Saudis surrendered, the conflict continued to drag and realignments continued to happen. And these will likely continue to play out for the next couple months. To pinpoint finally the Saudi vision for peace, the Saudis don't want to have a hostile Iranian-backed regime in Sana'a. And they perceive that the Houthi movement or the Houthi insurgency has some wings. Some are hardliners and some have, political motives. But at the end of the day, they're all guided by a shared doctrine, whether latent or obvious. And they care about the security of their southern border. So they want to have some sort of demilitarization there. And the Houthis have been able to threaten the strategic depth and civilian infrastructure by firing ballistic missiles and drones very occasionally. So the vision of peace for the Saudis is to have a face-saving exit. And that could be in any way, but far away from having a sustainable peace in Yemen. So no one outside Yemen has a vision for a sustainable peace in Yemen, although the Saudis should have interest in that, for the security of their borders, the security of the people, the security of the Gulf region, and shipping lines across the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. And I leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Yes. All right. So actually, I would like to have some few questions for Julia and also for Ibrahim. Starting with Julia, and as I mentioned earlier, so you said the Houthis, they do not have any interest in peace, and Dr. Anel also said that the Saudis, they don't have interest in peace. So the really very complicated problem. How can we install peace in a country that both parties are not interested in implementing peace then? So since we are talking about a new roadmap, is it applicable to have a new roadmap for peace, or is it just a kind of propaganda? Everyone is talking about peace in Yemen and let's do some peace for Yemen, and nothing is going to happen. Yeah, let me unmute you. Sorry, we had to mute everyone because of that. All right.
That makes sense. Yes. Thank you very much, Mohammed, for this question. So I think it's very unfortunate that Anel can join back, because I wanted to challenge her notions on Saudis don't have an interest in having peace, because I think there is a difference between having an interest in having peace and having stability, but I'm quite sure that the Saudis are very much interested in having stability in Yemen, simply because it's a neighboring country. And that can take many forms. For 33 years, it took the form of Saleh's rule. Maybe this is going to be something else now. And then the Houthis and how they can be pressured to have or incentivized and pressured at the same time to have interest in peace. I think it's such a complicated question that it's almost impossible to crack it. Now, there is also another prospect that I think might pressure and the Houthis to engage in a more conciliatory approach. And that would be if significant infighting and rivalry or splitting is happening within the Houthi movement. There are reports on certain fractionalization tendencies in the Houthis, but quite little is known about this. Now, if the Houthis as a movement is weakened, then parts of the movement might find it a viable strategy to have a power sharing agreement with the government. And this can lead the way. But not to avoid your question, I think if we again take this macro and rather local Yemeni perspective, one interesting and I think fascinating development in Yemen was back in 2014 when the National Dialogue Conference happened. That was truly a participatory exercise. And gaining the views of large segments of society, such as it happened then in the NDC, even though that the that time Southern movement and the Houthis at the end declined and rejected the outcomes. I think this is a model for a long-term sustainable peace. And any outcome that will happen from this war, which I am quite pessimistic regarding its length, because I really do not think that this is going to end very soon. Although the US can pressure the Saudis, and thus the Saudis can pressure certain actors in Yemen. Providing a viable future for Houthi fighters when they are satisfied with the outcomes is a very challenging task. And it really requires something that doesn't only benefit the Houthis, but society at large. And this is why I'm a very big enthusiast of having something similar as to the National Dialogue Conference a couple of years ago. So this would be my very complicated and kind of evading answer to your question. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, actually, just let me remind you of the same thing happened actually after the death of Khashoggi. Everyone was talking about Yemen, and every country started to put pressure on Saudi Arabia, telling Saudi that they have to stop war in Yemen, but then nothing happened. 3 years passed and we're still waiting. Anyway, thank you for your optimistic approach for the Yemeni case. So back to Dr. Ibrahim. Dr. Ibrahim, the US and their cancellation of the Houthis designation as a foreign terrorist organization. Do you think that the Houthis, they lost a chance that was given by the US?
What chance do you mean?
They were given a chance by removing them from the list. So, but now what's happening in Marib is totally opposite to what they're supposed to do. So,
okay. Let me point. I'm not a doctor. Just for clarity. To answer your question, no. I think the whole FTO debate was interesting because, you know, for long, the international community have been looking for non-violent means of leverage vis-a-vis the Houthis. I mean, and the Houthis could have, sent some reciprocal message to reassure the international community that they could be constructive, and then do what they're best at, just reversing against any sort of agreement. But the excitement was that they could take Marib within the next couple days. If you've noticed the propaganda and disinformation campaigns, you've seen so many things like the capture of Marib governor, or that they already advanced to the city. And that tells you one thing, that they think, the Houthis believe that the military business is unfinished, just like many others. They're not alone, but they are capable of recruiting, thousands and hundreds of thousands of Yemenis, most notably children and youth. And that tells you what value could they give to human life. And by sending the wrong message, the US might have lost some sort of leverage on some issues, because Dr. Julia mentioned that there could have been some topics to address some confidence building measures, like diffusing the Sarter tanker and granting the UNOPS team access to maintain it, fix it, and unload the oil. That could be just one of the issues. Or pay civil servant salaries by getting the money of Hodeidah port revenues deposited at CBY Hodeidah branch for civil servants, or even the opening of Sana'a airport for commercial flights. And it could have been used in many ways to exercise leverage, but that has not happened.
Actually, the removing Houthis from the list was for free. At least the US should have tried to get something, to gain something from the Houthis towards peace, but that was like for free. I was surprised because of that, because we are telling that the Americans and the international community should put pressure on the Houthis. So the pressure was there. So why to remove it then? What do you think?
Yeah, perfect. To be honest, I was not surprised when they left the group, because it was very expected. Biden sent a message. It's just that people did not get the intended message. Biden sent messages when he was campaigning. I'm coming and I'll punish certain actors and we will do this. So the signals were already there. And when he posed the designation, he added a layer of predictability, and he promised that American diplomacy will be back, and ending war in Yemen from his perspective was on the agenda. So for him to engage constructively and appoint an envoy, in fact, he should have done that. But yeah, it was conceded for free, and no one knows why so. Yeah.
All right. So let me just go back to the point that you mentioned about Griffiths. So do you think it's time to change Griffiths and to send a new guy to Yemen? Would that help?
I genuinely do not think that bringing a third guy would change a lot in the landscape. Any newly appointed guy would have to take some time to kind of, get the background and understand the dynamics. It would take so much time. But Griffiths, that said, does have to change the way he has been doing things. Because if you look at his track record over the past 3 years, I mean, it speaks for itself, what has been accomplished. He went for, Walid Sheikh Ahmed, although he was not the finest, he was more of a humanitarian, even in the way he approached peace. But he managed to gather the warring parties, the government and the Houthis more than 3 times at least, face to face. They talked issues extensively. And they talked about Yemen, all Yemen. They talked about substantive issues. When Martin Griffiths came, he shifted his way from nationwide peace talks to a governorate level to halt the offensive for Hodeidah. And that was the center of gravity back then. had Hudaydah fallen to the government, you know, the landscape of the conflict would have changed dramatically. And now that he has been since then involved, like in 2019, trying to send messages, we're making progress through some PR campaigns or whatever, but literally nothing has been accomplished.
So you're saying changing the way he is dealing with the Yemeni conflict might help. So
the way he deals with it, the way he thinks of it, and the way he should reconfigure his pieces. Right now, he's not doing so. He's pushing for a joint declaration, and we know all. Julia knows what people do with ceasefires. Her expertise lies specifically in that.
It seems that he's pushing so much for the joint declaration. He said this is the solution in Yemen. I'm not sure if that's really going to happen, but let's have some comments from our viewers here. Let's hear it from Omar Munassar.
First, first, thank you all for this insightful and informative panel. Here I just have some quick and repetitive comments on the common Western Center approach to the Yemen crisis. Of course, regardless of the grim reality that we should absolutely admit that the Yemeni government has declined so much in many aspects. That does not mean to drive things and events to a de facto situation that favors the Houthis. Second, the Western analysts and observers, as well as the international community, should stop sugarcoating the facts in Yemen for participant or partisan regional gains. Third, flowery humanitarian approaches could only relieve, but never ever bring peace to Yemen. Fourth, they should stop sophistry and demanding concessions from the victim rather than from the aggressors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar. And now let's hear some comments from Aufi. Are you there? If not, let's have Dr. Adil Dushaila.
Yes,
yes,
thank you. Okay, thank you all. I would like to ask Dr. Julia, how can United States and the international community implement a comprehensive and sustainable peace in Yemen, while Houthis militias insist to keep weapon public funds under their hands? And the second question, do you think that international community understand the reality of the internal conflict in Yemen? What's the problem between Yemenis and Houthis? All the time, international community says there is a humanitarian crisis or crisis. There is a security vacuum in Yemen. Yes. The problem between Yemenis and the Houthis is that Houthis want to rule Yemen by a religious theory or theocratic theory. How can we implement a peace with Houthis and they don't accept Yemenis? I think that international community must understand the root of the problem, and at the same time, Europeans, Americans have to address the root of the problem. Then we can implement a peace in Yemen. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Or should I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
You're in here now. Yes, thank you very much, Ada, for these comments. And I think you touched upon a very crucial issue. And I'm not gonna appear as a hypocrite, because I think I'm also part of an outsider perspective, although I might have a little more insight on Yemen than an average observer from the West. But I think there is basically people are quite often lazy to understand that what's happening, what are the real root causes of the conflict in Yemen in the first place. Just remember back in 2015 when the conflict started and when all the accusations of the Houthis being an Iranian militia started. Now, none of those articles or even studies essentially featured so much analysis on differences between 5er and 12er Shia. There is very little talk about that, what happened then to those Houthis who have converted to the Iranian version of Shiism, thereby bringing something very foreign to Yemen that hasn't been there previously. These are core issues that are impacting identity politics in an already fragmented country, which was not that long ago unified, but hasn't really been unified ever, right? Because of South and North Yemen has always had these problems and different development trajectories. So I don't think that the international community, whoever that is, understands what's happening in Yemen. And I also don't necessarily think that they do want to understand it, or they want to spend so much time on understanding it. This doesn't mean that they're against peace, but this would always entail then a superficial understanding of peace that follows a template approach, which I think is very much connected to the bureaucratic working of such systems as the UN, which is essentially not suitable for such a conflict as the one in Yemen, where things are happening rapidly, yet the UN is always lacking in terms of action. Condemning a group on Twitter or putting out a statement is symbolic, but won't bring peace to this country. And I think one fundamental issue through which the international community can be really helpful is that engaging with phenomenal Yemeni institutions as researchers to help them to understand that what really is going on, and not just diaspora members. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Let's have some comments from Abdullah Ba'aboud. Yes, Mr. Abdullah, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, sorry, I'm actually driving, so it'll be a very quick question. First of all, thank you very much. Very enjoyable panel and enlightened with many of their views. But since no one is really interested from what I hear in the peace, like Saudi Arabia or the Houthis, my question is the legitimate Yemeni government interested itself also in the peace process, and what are they doing to force this issue? Thank you. I'm driving, so I will have to be quick on this. Thank you.
So I will forward that question for Mr. Ibrahim.
Thank you for the thought-provocative question, Dr. Abdullah, and it's nice to see you here. It's really a tough question. The government is, to my perspective, is competing with many priorities. Stabilization in Aden, trying to coordinate a team of rivals, having seen the intensification between the government and the UAE-backed STC throughout, 2020 and before that, 2019. So I think it really has to unify its strengths to strengthen its position and then head for unconditional peace talks. But this should be also met with credible military pressure, because without that, I don't think the dialogue between the government and the Houthis, as well as the STC, who will be part of the government, but might be representing its voice from the inside, will make it easy. I don't think there is an easy answer, because certainly there are also people within the ranks of the government or the Houthis or the STC who are benefiting from the continuation of these dynamics. And so long as these are or continue to be dominating forces from within, they're most likely unobserved. They don't show up a lot, but they influence the whole world economy. That needs to be reversed for us to be able to move forward. I think that's my 2 cents. I hope I answered in some way, or even partly, your difficult
Thank you
question.
so much. All right. So with Dr. Anel is back. Welcome back, Dr. Anel. We are sorry to lose you because of as a result of that attack. Let me just unmute you. You're unmuted right now. So welcome back, Dr. Anel. Actually, Dr. Julia was challenging your view of saying that the Saudis are not really interested in implementing peace in Yemen. So she said, no, they might be interested in long sustainability, and actually she's disagreeing, obviously, with your view. What do you think?
Well, very happy to be back. Had a little trouble getting back in, so thanks for everyone's help and getting me back online. So I'm on my phone now, so it might look a little odd.
That's perfect.
So I certainly hope that the Saudis would be interested in returning or to having a sustainable peace in Yemen. I think at this point the Saudis have hopefully learned, and I think many Saudis would agree that yes, the situation prior was preferable to the current situation, since clearly I think Mohammed bin Salman himself, maybe not publicly, but he might agree that perhaps the military intervention, given that it has resulted in Saudi Arabia being in a more difficult position than it was prior to the military intervention, that hopefully it would agree that perhaps that was a bad decision. And so I think Julia is probably right that at this point, yes, the Saudis would rather have a stable, peaceful Yemen on their southern border. They probably would prefer to not have the Houthis in control, which is why they continue to support the Hadi government. Although again, as I said, they aren't necessarily providing sufficient support to allow the Hadi government to act. This is based on hearsay, what I've heard from people on the ground, that there has been frustration, that they feel that there's not been sufficient support from the Saudi government to actually allow them to win or to be more militarily effective. So when I said that, I more meant that Saudi Arabia had maintained this long-term policy of funding groups within Yemen, different groups that kind of contributed to maintaining a weak state within Yemen, that not allowing the central state to consolidate, which, I think my understanding of what would be a solution for Yemen is not necessarily a strong and powerful central state at this point. That moving forward, I do think a federal system in Yemen is more likely to result in a more sustainable peace arrangement, sort of the ability of different groups to be able to pursue their own interests, and that trying to impose a central state at this point is unlikely to be effective. But part of the reason Yemen is in this situation is because of this long-term policy of Saudi Arabia funding different groups within Yemen that helped to prevent the central state from becoming more powerful and helped to keep Yemen very weak, which again, the Saudis didn't necessarily want a powerful and very populous state on their southern border. They preferred a weak Yemen. But again, I agree that at this point, the Saudis may realize, well, they'd rather not have the current situation. And so it would be in Saudi's interest to help support, my hope, inshallah, that in the future, once we are in a situation in Yemen where peace has, the negotiated peace is on the way to being implemented, that Saudi Arabia will contribute to development funds, to reconstruction funds, that this is crucial for Yemen moving forward. And not just Saudi Arabia, but the whole world is really, well, the main actors, the US, EU, UAE, Iran, all need to be on the hook to contribute to funding Yemen's reconstruction, having profited so greatly from its devastation.
Yeah, all right, thank you so much. Now we go back to Mr. Aufi. Yes, go ahead. Mr. Aufi, are you there?
Yes, hello, good morning. Do you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much for this informative session. I enjoyed listening to you all, guys. just send my greetings to Mr. Ibrahim. He has visited us here in Sydney and we met in person. So what I want to ask is about the core of the issue in Yemen. I think nobody have addressed the real issue in Yemen, the core of the conflict, which is actually the Hashemite supremacy. We have a group of people in Yemen that believe that they are superior, their bloodline is pure, and they have to rule Yemen by force. This is the real problem of the issue there, and Yemeni people doesn't want to accept it. And I'm not sure whether it has been addressed to the maybe international community or they have a real vision on it. Because what we have, when I asked myself like 10 years ago when I was displaced from my home from Sana'a by Houthis, I was just wondering what motivated Abdul Malik al-Houthi, who never attended a school or even hardly can read and write, to launch this aggressive attack against Yemeni people. That's the only reason that motivates him is that he believes he is better than other people. He is the offspring of Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, and he has to rule Yemeni by force. Anyone who denies that, he will be actually killed. And this is the problem. We have a movement just like Nazi and Nazism and fascism. We have to address that. We have to discuss this issue and just show it to the international community that people in Yemen are suffering because of these, sickening beliefs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Actually, Mr. Aufi, he raised a very important point that the international community, they don't really understand what's happening in Yemen. And that what Ibrahim also said earlier, that the international community are shifting the focus from having a war in Yemen into having just a humanitarian crisis, Dr. Anel. And that takes us back to also the question of Dr. Adel. He said, and I forward the same question to you, Dr. Anel, do you think that the international community understand what's really happening in Yemen?
I think that's a very good point. No, I think a lot of people don't understand. Obviously, there's been a media blackout imposed by the Houthis in Sana'a and in many of the areas they control. And I definitely agree. My understanding, again, not to say that I fully understand everything either. But yes, that this notion of the Houthis of Hashemite supremacy is incompatible with an inclusive and democratic, the hope that Yemen's future government would be inclusive and democratic. And so I do agree that in the past I've made the comparison, which may not be totally accurate, but it may be useful to think about lessons from the Taliban, for example, the extent to which that they have been able to maintain and now consolidate control of Afghanistan in a way that is incompatible with many who would hope that Afghanistan could achieve a more democratic and inclusive future. My understanding as well is that not everyone within the Houthi movement and not all members would necessarily agree with sort of Hashemite supremacy to the same extent. There's generally much variation of viewpoints within a given movement, and so it might be possible in the future for the diplomatic process to try to elevate the voices of those who are willing to go along with a negotiated settlement that would recognize the rights of all Yemenis. My understanding again was that part of why, back in either late 2014 or early 2015, when the Houthis had almost agreed to sort of withdraw, and this was right before Saudi Arabia began and the Arab coalition launched their intervention, that as a result of the National Dialogue Conference and efforts within Yemen domestically to try to resolve the issues, that the Houthis were willing to agree to that, but that they didn't like the notion that they were going to have to go back to Saada, where they don't really have resources. And so I do think that there's a way to hopefully find a middle ground here, to recognize that the Houthis are not interested in returning to sort of the status quo ante, which is part of where they launched their 6 wars against the state of Yemen, against President Saleh's forces, that they were dissatisfied with that. And now that they've achieved power, this is part of why they're so intransigent in any sort of negotiated settlement or any sort of movement towards peace. But again, the hope would be that moving forward, the Houthis would recognize that it is also in their interest, and that a future negotiated settlement would acknowledge that they have rights as well, but that they do not have the right to subjugate other Yemenis or to assert this sort of supremacist doctrine.
Thank you so much. Actually, Dr. Julia, she also mentioned something regarding to the disarming or the difficulty of disarming Houthis here. So and also the Houthis are not really willing to give up their weapons, and that sounds illogical. So they want to gain more and more land, and they want to be actually, they are representing themselves as the real Yemenis and the real legitimacy of Yemen. So let me just go back to Griffith's work in Yemen. We discussed that when we were gone. So we talked about that Griffiths has spent 3 years in Yemen with insufficient results, and his work just speaks for himself, like he couldn't achieve anything yet. So do you think that Griffiths has something else to offer for the warring parties to come into peace? Would the joint declaration be a solution, for example?
Do you want me to respond?
Yes.
Yes. So inshallah, now that it seems that the Biden administration is paying attention to Yemen and actually exhibiting some hope, I hope what will be sustained commitment to actually achieving peace in Yemen, and not merely a quick negotiated ceasefire or something like that, but actually achieving sustainable peace in Yemen. I mean, unfortunately, the U.S. unfortunately or not, the rest of the world often takes cues from the United States. And so the extent to which previously U.S. policy, especially under the Trump administration, was merely about, continuing to sell massive amounts of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and similar under the Obama administration, that the Obama team was willing to look the other way as Saudi Arabia launched its intervention. So my hope is that, given so far this seems to be a priority for the Biden team, that this will help signal to other countries around the world that there needs to be a lot more pressure. And so I hope that Griffiths will be working with more power behind him now. I mean, the EU Parliament, perhaps this was already mentioned when I was off, but the EU Parliament just passed a tough and far-reaching resolution having to do with ending or pushing for an end to arms sales. It's non-binding. But again, it's just an indication that various powerful international actors are paying more attention. And again, I think it's crucial that this pressure not let up, and that my concern is that there will be sort of momentary interest in Yemen, and then people will go back to ignoring it, which would be unconscionable. So I think it's crucial that events such as this and attention from journalists and people all over the world keep talking about what's happening in Yemen, and hopefully, as the questioner mentioned, that people don't necessarily understand, that hopefully as there is more attention and more pressure, that hopefully the international community's understanding of what's happening in Yemen will grow more nuanced and more accurate.
Right, let's have some questions from Mr. Abdullani. Yes, Abdullani. You said you have a question.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Welcome, everyone. I would ask Julia and Elenia, in general, how do you get news and information on Yemen? In fact, there are a lot of fake news and lack of understanding. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for, if I may start, Soria, now, answering. I think this is the best question I have ever received, to be honest, seriously. I can say that I'm lucky enough that I have friends in and from Yemen. So mostly I'm reading the news first in international outlets, and when something is, and from Twitter, because there are quite a few well-established scholars who are working in Yemen, but also outside of Yemen. And Anel has also mentioned Sarah Phillips. There is also Marieke Transveld. There are a couple of European scholars who are excellent experts on Yemen. So I usually follow their things on Twitter. I'm always reading what Ibrahim writes, basically, and particular studies on Carnegie's side, US side.
You have a quiet supporter, right, Ibrahim?
A fan.
And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. So when I'm usually reading something that I find interesting, but I'm not necessarily sure whether I should believe this or not, in terms of following news, then I ask people who are there. Now, I'm mostly working on, in my day-to-day job, I'm working on external actors' interventions and interest in Yemen. And those people are usually located either in Norway or in the US or internationally. So it's way easier to get information from them about what they are doing in Yemen, other than getting credible information from the ground. And I just want to raise, before I give the word back to Anel, another thing about the UN is that I do recognize the extremely difficult position of the UN, including the UN Special Envoy, because this is a tough situation to do anything in, especially when your hands are so much bound by all these bureaucratic processes. But at the same time, back in 2019, there was this horrible AFP News investigation that how much and to what extent there is corruption in the aid system in Yemen. And this goes back to Anel's very first point when she was mentioning the war economy. Now, unfortunately, the aid community, quite often, certain members of the aid community can also be part of this. And this is also something that would require way more transparency from all actors. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Anel.
First, just to say I completely agree with Dr. Julia's point about the extent to which certain aid actors are complicit in funding the war economy and contributing to it, and so definitely agree with the need for much greater transparency, which is part of why I try to be careful in my remarks to say that funding should go towards development and towards supporting existing Yemeni actors on the ground, and not necessarily trying to simply fund a long-term aid project in Yemen where, you know, this will completely alter sort of economic incentives on the ground and prevent local Yemeni businesses and you know, the local Yemeni economy from being self-sustainable. So I do think that's crucially important. Back to the question of where do I get my information and how to deal with the abundance, unfortunately, of misinformation online in general. I mean, this is something the whole world is struggling with in many ways. And we saw this obviously having a huge impact on US elections. Obviously, the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th as a result of misinformation about the results of the US election. And we face it ourselves in terms of, well, it's so wonderful that all of us can come together from all over the world to be together on this Zoom panel, and that we can have, you know, people listening in from all over the world. You know, as we experienced, people were also able to try to disrupt this, which is unfortunate. And so it remains a question moving forward of how to continue to benefit from the democratic access to information, that you can go on Twitter and see that I go on Twitter and try to follow a broad diversity of views related to Yemen. And sometimes I have, you know, if I see some information, I will check with Yemenis who have a better level of expertise than I do, to say, hey, is this credible? What do you know about this? So I think similar to Julia, I do try to check things and verify things if they're not coming from a source that I necessarily recognize or that I suspect might not be the most credible source. But again, this is a bigger question moving forward of how to allow both the democratic access to information and the ability to spread one's views, but to acknowledge the many ways in which that is often abused by powerful actors. For example, Saudi Arabia, for example, the United States as well, that this is something that powerful actors online are able to advance their own preferred narrative and to really drown out the truth. I think you might be muted.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, I would like to end this session by answering this question from Abdul Wahid Az-Zumar. He said that, and this question goes to everyone, do you think that Biden administration is really interested in ending the Yemeni war and bringing political stability to the country, or they are just using the Yemeni situation as a leverage on the Iranians to push them to accept the deal, the nuclear deal? Let's start with Ibrahim. What do you think? Yeah, I have to unmute you guys, Ibrahim. Yes.
Okay, now unmuted. Thank you. I think this is a good question. And that goes back to how the United States sees the region. What are the strategic interests that it has in the Middle East and its grand strategy in the region. So it definitely has one, but it does not have a Yemen strategy or even a Yemen policy. So back in 2015 and 2014, Yemen and Syria paid the price for the GCPO to move forward, given that the United States under President Obama was, less keen to complicate the understandings with Iran through escalations in Syria or Yemen. And that's a good question. So some of the steps that the administration has taken in its first 30 days is part and parcel of its attempts to revive the GCPO. And that technically, as my fellow delegates have pointed, it keeps the Yemen file as a tool for other ends. And if you want to go to the answer, which is the next question, which is the United States interested in ending the war in Yemen? The question is, which war? And you see many people asking that question. Is it the war between the government and the Houthis, or the Saudi-led coalition and other entities, or the UAE engagement? Which aspect specifically? Or is it just the American support to the coalition, and from that lens, that's perceived as ending the war? So, there is also a war of narratives that they're trying to export. When President Biden took the podium in the State Department and mentioned ending war, it was like America is going to end it next month by just curtailing support. But this is, a whole flawed assumption. And many Yemenis fear that a degree of approachment with Iran would reflect on approachment and flexibility and more margin for its proxies and partners, from Hezbollah in Lebanon, passing through Assad and in Syria, and going all the way to Al-Hashd in Iraq, and then the Houthis in Yemen. So whatever degree of flexibility happens with Iran, it has to be parallel with something more or less around it to pave the way for some sort of processes to move forward. Yeah. So it's not detached from Iran.
Right. Dr. Anel?
Thanks. Yeah, just the first question, I do think there are key individuals within the Biden administration who feel really bad about what's happened in Yemen. And people like Rob Malley, Stephen Pomper wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs just handful, last week or a few weeks ago, where they admitted how they were responsible for the Obama administration's sort of willingness to not condemn, at least. I mean, the sense was that Saudi Arabia, their understanding was Saudi Arabia was going to intervene regardless of what the US said. However, the US should have immediately told them not to and not offered any support, which likely would have shifted Saudi calculus. And so these individuals felt guilty, and now they're in positions of power to try to address that. So I do think there are people within the Biden administration who know that they're responsible for in part, they contributed to the devastation of Yemen, and they want to address that. But I completely agree with Ibrahim that Biden making this statement that the US can simply end the war in Yemen is completely inaccurate and reflects, again, this sort of American hubris toward the region in general, that the US is able to do something like that. I think that this, although it does reflect hubris, I hope that this attitude could perhaps be used to the benefit of Yemen, that if Biden believes it's his responsibility and in his power to do something, then that will help motivate him to help pressure the Saudis and their Emiratis. To the question of Iran, although I agree that Biden views the Iran issue as all tied up with Yemen as it is, as I said at the beginning, I don't think that even if Iran completely withdraws support for the Houthis, that the Houthis are going to continue to act aggressively. And they might have a curtailed ability to do so, but again, I don't think simply addressing or if Biden is in a position eventually to finally pressure Iran to stop supporting the Houthis, that's not going to end the conflict. But again, the hope would be that would help push actors within Yemen. If all foreign intervention ceased, then on the incentives on the ground would shift, hopefully sufficiently, towards the possibility for negotiated ceasefire.
Thank you so much. All right, Dr. Julia.
Yes, I will be brief. We had excellent comments so far.
Yes, Hussam. Let's have Julia first, then we will have a question from Hussam. Yes. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Julia.
Yes. So the question read as, do you think the Biden administration is really interested in ending the Yemeni war and bringing political stability to the country? Now, I think whether or not it's interested, its interest is going to be function of its capacity, both in terms of how much manpower can the State Department basically allocate to the case of Yemen. And also let us just don't forget that there is a global pandemic now, which certainly eats up most of the Biden administration's and all administrations' effort and time. So I think it's too early to say, to give a short answer. I think this was a very powerful first statement. At the same time, I'm also, and maybe asking this from Anel because she might know more about this, let us don't forget that Biden said that this war must end, and also that the aggression against the Saudis also end. So there is a protective approach while a very mild condemning, not even a condemning, there is a protective approach to Saudi Arabia as it has always been from the side of the US, and it's stating that it's going to end fueling the conflict by selling weaponry to Saudi Arabia. But it is not clear that what type of weaponry, when, whether it's defensive or offensive for these purposes. And also let us don't forget that what has been, I completely agree with Ibrahim, again, from an outsider perspective, that Yemen has always featured more of part of a Gulf portfolio and has never been an individual policy in itself for the US. But let us don't forget that back in 2003, right before the Sada war started, it was the global war on terror campaign that provided the first substantial engagement of the US in the country, which then resulted in significant security aid flowing into the country, which was then misused and diverted by the Saleh administration to fight the Houthis then, part of this at least. And I think the US will forever have a very strong terrorism outlook in Yemen. And maybe that will be the most important from the US. But in short, I think it's way too early to say that how the US is going to play a role in the longer time now.
Thank you so much. Hussam, yes, let's have final comments from Hussam.
Hi, everyone. I have a question for Mr. Ibrahim. After the American administration revoked Houthis from FTO list, we heard that Biden administration, they will pressure on the Houthis. On the other hand, we have heard comments from the American side says that in coming days they will do a nuclear deal with Iran, and at the same time we see a major pressure on the Saudi side. So while we are seeing this picture, what are the tools that may Biden administration use to pressure on the Houthis? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before answering that, let me just take one more question from Nabil Al-Bukairi. Mr. Nabil, yes.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I have one question for all speakers. This question is, why is the democratic approach to the situation in the Arab world always swipe in the terms of the empowering sectarian militaries, which represent the greatest obstacle to the democratic political transition in the Arab world? This is completely inconsistent with the slogans and agendas of the United States and the democratic in particular. As if what is happening is implementation of the prophecy of the American, of the Iranian organizer Wali Nasr in his famous book Awakening of the Shiites, which is written in 2004. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Yes, back to you, Ibrahim.
Okay. This is a zoom out interesting question, but let me begin with the comment of Hussam because it's easier, right? And what tools of leverage do they have? Well, they have military force, and that's the only language that they understand. But are they willing to use it? No, they're not. So do they have any leverage? No, they don't. That's the short and brief answer. Yeah, and just to tackle Nabil's good question, and that you know what resonates with me is Dr. Abdullah Nafisi's remarks on how the Democrats have this approach to manage the transitional network of non-state actors in the region. And if I might even bring in Henry Kissinger, is that America involves by holding the strings of these issues. America does not have to resolve them, right? And by staying engaged, America has leverage and can advance its interests. Its resolution is not a primary interest. And where you have these non-state actors who are more of armed and very capable, mainly due to illicit arms transfer from the Iranian regime, is that you have continuously evolving security paradigm in the region. In the past decade, had it not been for the post-Arab Spring developments, one would be suspicious that the wave of normalization with Israel would have happened. And that's technically in part because of the changing dynamics, whether that is security relations and alignment, so even the threat perception. So, you know, you had a shift that Sunni Arab states have to cooperate with Israel to counter the Iranian-backed threats, which is in part have covert relations with the United States and even the UK. Not all what's being said on the podiums or microphones reflect the reality of of their cooperation in any way, shape, or form. And I think this should be clearly understood. So to say it brief, the proliferation of these non-state armed actors, as Dr. Anel mentioned earlier, are a great interest for the military industrial complex in some part. They keep some countries interested in buying more arms. And from the security dilemma issues, arms race continue to increase. And with that, you know, we're just involved and we control the rules of the game. If that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Julia?
Yes, to be honest, I'm a little lost that what should I comment on? Because I thought it was addressed to Ibrahim. So if someone can repeat the question, that would be a great help for me.
The last question was about the comparison between supporting Sunnis is going to help to defeat Shiis, or it's the otherwise. And he said that the Democrats are dealing with this idea by, they believe that supporting the Shiis more is the way to solve or to settle the situation in the region.
Yes, thank you very much. And sorry for not paying sufficient attention. What I believe in, that might be a little naive, and that's fine, I guess. I think rather than taking necessarily sides in what and which faction, also which faction within Shiism and Sunnism to strengthen, then what would be very interesting is to develop effective forums for Sunni-Shia dialogues, which is currently very much missing from the peace architecture, both at the UN level and at regional organizational level. And now I'm talking about the GCC, for example, or other regional organization that might provide a platform, not necessarily US-led, but with a US presence, where this type of dialogue, religious dialogue, can happen. And what happens with that? I don't know. No one has ever tried it in a large scale, I guess. And then supporting one faction at the expense of the other. I think this has been the feature of world politics, and it's going to be the feature of world politics forever. And I think particularly Yemen is a good example of that. Not only states that are in this macro level can influence these local conflicts through proxies, but these proxies are not agency-less actors, but they're also able to utilize, because they are aware that, okay, if I act in a certain way, or if I advocate a certain approach, that might lead to more support, either rhetorical or actual military support. So I think we often forget about the ones who are actually fighting, and that they also understand that the external actors can be manipulated. And that's an important part in this sectarian narrative for the war as well.
Thank you so much. Dr. Anel, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I really agree with everything both Ibrahim and Julia just said. Just to get back to this question of how exactly to pressure the Houthis, I agree with Ibrahim's assessment that military pressure would likely be most effective, and yet the Biden administration is not going to be willing to use that. And so, which personally, I don't necessarily think more military involvement would help in general. I think involving more weapons and more military and further empowering the notion that the military can resolve things is a flawed paradigm, and that moving forward, it needs to be there needs to be a lot more effort put behind reshaping that sort of thinking. And again, part of why that thinking is so prevalent has to do with the existing very powerful interests driving weapons manufacturers, and the extent to which big countries like the United States continue to rely heavily on the military-industrial complex as a source of jobs domestically. Thinking about Yemen, I do worry, because both under the Trump administration and under Biden, the shift has been and probably will continue to be towards China. And my hope is that this does not become a new sort of Cold War paradigm, which I think would be a huge waste of resources, when instead the world needs to be focusing on actual shared threats like climate change, pandemics, etc. And so moving forward, my understanding and my sense of it is that the US isn't going to be paying as much attention to the Middle East. Likely, unfortunately, the counter-terror paradigm will continue to dominate US thinking towards the region, which I think is a total mistake, because as a result of the past 20 years of the counter-terror paradigm dominating the US approach to the region, we've seen nothing but instability and violence. So again, my hope moving forward, especially in terms of the question about sort of the Sunni Shia sectarianism, well, it is important. I'm very suspicious of this sort of narrative, because we know from the historical record that the notion that Sunni and Shia always fight each other and they can't live peacefully alongside each other is completely disproven by much of the history of the region and elsewhere in the world. And so I think a lot of this is driven by this existing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so moving forward, I think it will be crucial for Iran to be allowed, hopefully, to rejoin the JCPOA, to be allowed to engage in the region in a way that is not sort of reflecting its current isolation. And so my hope is that in the future, this is a very idealized sort of notion. I understand this won't be easy, but that moving forward, these countries will recognize that they simply can no longer afford to invest huge amounts of their GDPs into the military, that their own survival as governments will be dependent on addressing the needs of their own population. I think Mohammed bin Salman, for all of his many flaws and his willingness, almost his eagerness to use violence, does recognize that the current model in Saudi Arabia is not working, which is why he's emphasizing a shift in the Saudi economy, things like Vision 2030. So although I'm alarmed at Mohammed bin Salman's leadership, I do hope that he is successful in that effort, but that will require him to stop spending huge amounts of money on the military. And similar to Iran and to other countries in the region, that moving forward, it would be in all of their mutual interests to stop fighting each other and instead to focus on the real issues, which is addressing the needs of their population as the climate warms, as the world is heading for a period of great instability. And so it would be in everyone's mutual interest to focus on addressing those looming huge challenges.
All right, thank you so much. And with that being said, I would like to end this seminar by thanking our panelists, Dr. Anel, Dr. Julia, and Ibrahim, who's going to be a doctor soon. So I would like to thank them for their fruitful and honest and optimistic views on Yemen, and hopefully we at least contributed somehow to the bringing peace to Yemen. So thank you so much again, and thank you all the viewers who joined us today. And I would like to apologize again for what happened at the beginning. So luckily we survived safe from that attack. Thank you so much, and I wish to see you again in the next discussion from Abad Research Center. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much. An honor to be part of it.
Thank you.